Today we're going to be talking about the rise and fall and maybe resurrection of Glossier. That maybe is not to imply that like we might get to it. It's more to say like it might be, I don't know. Hi guys, I'm Sam. If you haven't seen me on your screen before, I make content that is kind of all over the place, but I've been recently pivoting more toward kind of brand analysis, talking about certain topics that are going on online, media related, as well as social media in general. I have a degree in media and I have spent the last few years working at major tech companies doing social media management. Now I'm doing content creation full time and I'm so excited to have you guys join me. So let's talk about the dossier behind Glossier. I feel like I didn't use that word right, and that's totally okay. I've seen nearly every video under the sun on this topic, so if something sounds a little bit repetitive, it's probably because you too have a deep desire and interest in Glossier and you don't know why. Another thing is I read the book Glossy. I've read this book actually twice because the first time I read it, I kind of left it thinking I feel like I missed something or topics that were covered I just like got to listen to because I was listening to it as an audiobook and I was doing that while at work. Genuinely during that time I had no thoughts for anything that like were not work related, so in my mind I was like 55-hour weeks. I can somehow squeeze in a book here, and that book was Glossy and I'm like nothing stuck, like there's no way, like I missed something. And then rereading it I was like I actually missed nothing. I completely got the entire book. So I have a few gripes with it. I tend not to like being critical over media, especially when it's a medium that I myself don't have any level of expertise in. It feels weird, kind of like I feel like it's just like convoluting their actual work and like what they're good at and me just being like, I didn't like it. That's also how I feel about kind of talking about Glossier, because there are some parts of this business and industry, as much as I've been consuming and kind of doing so much in terms of beauty and makeup since a very young age. I started this channel 10 years ago and like that is what this channel was originally for, was beauty videos. I don't know the insides and outsides of the business. Because of that, there are going to be some things that I don't really touch on. For example, there's like this huge thing where everyone talks about how like it's a D2C model, and let me just say I literally don't give a shit about that at all. Mostly because I kind of don't really understand what they're trying to say when they talk about how like of a deal that is. When I worked at Amazon, that was essentially what I did. Like my job was managing these sellers. At like no point did I ever feel like the channel in which they were distributing the products meant a significant amount, even as someone whose job was taking care of sellers when they did that part of it as well. It's just to me like not super relevant. Also, another part of this is Rachel Weiss winds up being a really big topic in nearly all of these videos, and every single part of the book almost feels like an homage to Rachel Weiss. And I do not get this woman's name right and I don't know why. Her name is Emily Weiss, and I say Rachel Weiss like the entirety of the video other than maybe one time. And so I had to Google who Rachel Weiss was because I was like, why do I keep saying that? And apparently she's an actress in the movie The Mummy, and what's more interesting about that is I've never even seen that movie. I don't know why I keep saying this and I'm so sorry. And I just kind of never really cared that much about her. Not in a rude way by any means. Did I miss something? Like, was everyone obsessed with Rachel Weisz and I totally like missed out on this? Like, was she the it girl for a moment? And I actually don't think she was. Because of the nature of these stories and the way Glossier in general is framed in the media, I am going to talk about her just briefly. But again, I don't want this whole video to be about her. I want it to be about the brand. Rachel Weisz grew up in a very well-off suburb in Connecticut. The way I kind of envision it and the way it was kind of explained is very Charlotte York type of vibe. She was like really seen as this go-getter. One of the stories that's told about her is that like 16 she went up to one of her neighbors who worked at Ralph Lauren and was like, "Can I have a job?" And then everyone was like, "Woo, Rachel, you're such a go-getter, look at her go." And then to me, I sort of hear like that's just like a really privileged thing to be able to do, and I'm not gonna necessarily applaud that. Like, it's better than some other people, right? Like, she did have other neighbors and her other neighbors could have done the same thing and they didn't, so there's definitely something gritty about that, but not that gritty. Like, I don't know, if my parents were wealthy and my neighbors were people like executives at Ralph Lauren instead of teachers and nurses, I could maybe go up to them and say, "Hey, do you mind if I have a job?" They could get me a referral at like my my local school district. You know what I mean? Like it's not the same, Rachel. It's just not. A lot of the conversations also talked about how she worked at Teen Vogue, and because of that she was on The Hills. I never watched The Hills. I think that this is because I was like slightly after that generation. The Hills to me is very millennial, and a lot of Glossier is honestly millennial, so everything about this tracks. The interesting thing is that she was in a few episodes and she was seen as like this power intern. She wasn't really interested in like being on TV. She was interested in doing a good job. I do really admire that, because as someone who's like supposed to have really cared about working and like I have to be gritty with my work because I have to be good at it, because what am I gonna fall back on kind of thing, because if I didn't, I was screwed. The interesting thing about her is she didn't actually have to do that, right? Like she had a degree from NYU in studio art, so she wasn't really technically going into journalism, so she didn't really have to do all of the things that she was doing at Teen Vogue in the way to like make her way up at Condé Nast. It's just interesting to me because like she didn't have to do these things, but she chose to do these things. While working at these companies, she was able to interact with a lot of high-powered people and naturally talk to them about things like what's in their beauty cabinet, what do they use, what products. She was essentially getting this insider information that she didn't have access to and thought that other people would also really like access to it, so she started her blog Into the Gloss. Blogs were a huge thing at this time. I definitely also missed out on that, and I think it would have been so much fun. Like I would have loved the blog sphere. Essentially think of TikTok now, or even deeper than that, like think of original YouTube and like some of the girls who were doing like these back to school videos, right? Like at a time when you were searching back to school haul, there were like 8 girls who did it, and so every year I personally would just watch all of their videos. Same with Christmas, like what I got for Christmas, there were only ever so many videos that you could watch, and because of that the market wasn't that saturated. That really gave Rachel Weisz a huge advantage, because not only was the market not that saturated, but on top of that the blog world didn't really have someone going into these celebrities' cabinets and talking about what they were using. Think about those Vogue bathroom videos where these celebrities are getting ready and like showing their routines. That was essentially what Into the Gloss was. So like, not to say Vogue fully copied her, but like low-key a little bit. It's like whenever like Kim Kardashian says that she uses a certain product and then that product goes crazy and sells out. It's like akin to that. Because of that, she knew she could do a lot more with the brand and decided she wanted to look into some venture capitalists who would be interested in kind of putting their funds toward her and allowing her to grow the brand even larger. This is to me where things get a little bit foggy. It's not super clear if she was originally trying to be a part of this like zany crowd or what her next step was. It sort of seems like Glossier's creation story has more to do with the fact that she was trying to get funding for something and they actually just wanted her to have a product to show for it. It's kind of funny because part of the book Glossy talks about how she wanted these products to become shoppable. It's crazy to me because I feel like she invented Shopify mentally in her mind, or something along the lines of that, or like TikTok shop, or how you can shop on Instagram, something like that, but it wasn't really there yet. I think we wouldn't have Glossier if Amazon just literally had an affiliate program at the time. Like she could have just done affiliate link or like LTK type stuff. Like at no point did I think she recognized how big of a thing this was going to be. It's even funny because a little later in the book they talk about how like at some point there was like this weird push where she wanted to do like this tech mogul thing, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it kind of ties into like the original brainchild of this being far more of like a brand and not a tangible product. Fast forward, Glossier launches in I believe fall of 2014. It's so funny because if you look on the Wayback Machine, which I guess is not the most reputable source, it seems like Glossier launched and it didn't actually have any product. It's so weird to me. I'm gonna read you what was originally on their website because at some point they've had like 3 different mottos for their brand. Okay, so it reads as we're Glossier, a girl-powered company on a mission to rethink beauty by creating a line of essential, easy products that celebrate realness rather than cover it up. We believe beauty should be fun, easy, and personal. Above all, we believe that you give life to products. Products don't breathe life into you. 100% not tested on animals. And that was their website, March 2015. So that was post-launch. We went onto their Instagram in like fall 2013. I'm thinking like September. They used to have a different bio completely. That bio used to read, skin first, makeup second, smile always. They've since omitted that smile always bit. At some point they did have their hand on the pulse and like figuring out what consumers wanted or didn't want. There was definitely a big time like 2014 where like, I don't want to like completely shit on it, but like sort of like this very like white feminism became such a popular thing. And not to say it didn't do anything or that there wasn't benefit to this, but it talked about very kind of like surface level issues. So I remember during the Olympics a lot, like these athletes athletes would be competing, specifically women, and they'd be like, why aren't they smiling? Like, they should be having the time of their life. That whole trope of like construction workers being like, smile more, like you look so pretty if you smiled more. I think that was definitely omitted because of that kind of like rise to consciousness where we're like, hey, like women don't actually just have to be like hot and sexy all the time. Like we can also feel emotions. Just because like men don't seem capable of having complex emotions and like understanding any type of like emotional literacy doesn't mean that women just like have to like be like dumb little bimbos who are smiling all the time, you know? It's funny because they clearly like lost the plot so much after that point, because they did genuinely used to have such a good perspective on this, and then it kind of just like fell to shit. Moving on from Rachel Weisz, because to me like her story is not that interesting, and even looking at like, you know what, maybe I did totally just miss out on this it girl. I looked to see who I knew who was following her, and it was kind of funny because the people who I saw that were following her were either people who I worked with who were like people in the industry, so like they have to kind of be on part of these things. So it was people like Jenna Lyons, not implying that I ever worked with her, I certainly never did. Eva Chen, who is like the fashion lead at Instagram, and then people who I know who have worked with people like that. Those were the only people who I knew who followed her, or like influencers. It's just very interesting to me because I think there's this idea that she was just like this huge thing, and to regular consumers she wasn't. I think that's where the book misses a lot of it, is it doesn't remove the author who is a part of the beauty industry and also a journalist who has a personal relationship with Rachel Weisz. Emily Weisz. I keep on saying Rachel and it's crazy to me. She also has this like personal relationship with Emily Weisz that is just really interesting to me, that I don't fully understand how she felt like she was a good representation to write this book. For me personally, never really gave a shit about Emily. Did give a shit about influencers that I followed who were very cool in my mind, who were talking about Glossier. So Glossier was one of those brands who hit social media really quickly, and that's because it wasn't a brand at first, right? Like this was a love child of a real person who was trying to project a brand that she created. There were no hoops to jump through, and like as someone who's worked in social media at these large brands, like it is so hard to get something to go somewhere. It is actually infuriating. So because she didn't have those things to jump through, and like there were really very little stakes that came up, like it didn't really matter what she was posting on Instagram, so it was really more about a vibe than anything else. So instead of showing products, because at this time they didn't really have anything, it was just like the hot girls and like top shelves in bathroom cabinets referred to as shelfies, even having other brands featured on their feed, which is crazy to me because like that would be a cardinal sin. Like even now when I do brand deals, they're like, don't mention any other brands, like never mention any other brands. And I'm like, I'm getting ready, like I'm doing my makeup, I'm going to use other brands, like you gave me a mascara, and they're like, don't mention them, and you're like, I can't do that. It's kind of a funny thing because it really allows the consumer to not feel like they're being pushed into like this branding, right? Like they are following a brand with a real person behind it, and at the time that was 100% true. Not to say it's not true anymore, but obviously there are people who run the Glossier Instagram account and everything about it is 100% curated, but at the time it didn't really feel like that. I think this brings us into talking about the Glossier feed in a general sense and the memification of social media and how they really hit the mark on this so early on. I think a lot of times we reference brands like Wendy's or whatever when we're talking about social media. At least for a really long time, Wendy's was like the go-to. Now it's like Duolingo, and like everyone wants to be like Duolingo. Another one is like the Empire State Building. Like their TikTok is amazing. At the time, you really wouldn't talk about brands when you talked about social media. Like I'm trying to think back to who I followed in like 2013, 2014 on Instagram, and the answer was like beauty gurus who I followed on YouTube and then continued to stalk through Instagram. So think like Amanda Steele, Maddie Bragg, Bethany Moda, of course, Meredith Foster, Steal a Babe 09, but we're like not gonna really like talk about that. We'll talk about that maybe in a different video. Like I don't know what happened there. And then like celebrities, which we could also fully talk about in another video. But at the time I was 13 or 14 years old. I wasn't that interested in following these brands, but my sister was. My sister still to this day follows Glossier. She knew about this stuff far before I did because she was the kind of person who was on Tumblr. I never made it onto Tumblr. I think like that is unfortunately the Gen Z in me. Like it just never happened for me. But I did have a certain appreciation for it. Like I liked the Tumblr aesthetic. So whenever I'd search YouTube, I'd search like Tumblr outfit ideas. I'm trying to pinpoint when the model off duty thing kind of became like such a thing. And I would say it was around that time, but I think people were talking about clothing. They weren't really talking about makeup. Glossier was like the street style style of makeup. The idea was that the products were going to be very light, very dewy, and again, like kind of going into like that skincare first and then makeup second, and then you mattering so much, you little superstar. Something that's funny about this though is like, it's kind of bullshit, like looking back on it. And at the time, like in my mind, I'm like, if I take a photo with this product, they would repost me, and they would not repost me. Also, a lot of it had to do with like this flash photography that was really popular at the time, an aesthetic that I personally still love. There was a very popular nightclub photographer, I forget his name, but I remember like seeing his work on America's Next Top Model, which is a funny sentence to say. But the interesting thing about that was like this club photographer, and now I look back at some of these photos, I'm like, they weren't actually as good as I remember them being. But this idea of essentially being in front of this white wall and there's like flash photography and everything is like glossy and beautiful. I remember wanting to know how to create that aesthetic so badly, because it genuinely looked like at the time like they just took a photo with their phone with flash on and it became this beautiful image. That is in part true. If you live somewhere beautiful and everything you own is beautiful and you too are beautiful, you can take a photo casually and that photo can look beautiful. That's objectively just like an accurate statement, but it's not the most fair when it comes to this idea of just being natural, raw, organic. Even if you look through the feed, like they're not gonna post two product images next to each other. They're gonna space things out. So they're gonna do like a face with product, but it's gonna be like a fun little face with product. So it's gonna be like holding like a boy brow in your mouth while like doing it on like one eye, and you're just so quirky and you're silly and you're just like this girl who's casually applying makeup. And then the next shot is gonna be a photo of kittens and like a pile of bubbles and like feathers, and there's just cupcakes too, something adorable and amazing. And then the next photo is gonna be like of the sky, right? And then after that, you'll see a photo of like a shelfie, and the Glossier products will be in the photo, but same with like all of these other products too that are also really cute and cool. But the interesting thing is these products have to be a part of this like it girl aesthetic. They can't just be regular products. You can't just have Maybelline on these shelves. Like you need to have something cool. It has to be like a diptyque perfume. It has to be like a really expensive hair oil. It has to be things that these cool girls would use. They're French and you can only get them in French pharmacies. It's that kind of thing where it's so easy and it's so organic. And it's just you. But then you look back and you actually think about this and you're like, actually any type of aesthetic that's like this, and I still believe this to this day, if you are seeing something on your feed and they're like, they're so naturally this, they're so organically this, they're not really. I think about like these like blogger types who have like really perfect curated lives and they all talk really softly and they have like these beautiful kitchens and all of these things and they're getting all of these shots and it looks amazing and it looks so easy. But you have to consider, like with Nara Smith, when you see her videos, there's multiple angles. And you have to think about this in the way a creator would think about this. She stops the video, moves the camera, puts another camera there, or she's like recording from multiple cameras, but like think about it from the outside perspective of like how this actually goes. In order to look effortless, you have to try really, really hard. I think one of the biggest examples of this is like, think about like Simone Biles, right? And like other gymnasts. When they compete, they look insanely amazing and they look graceful and they look beautiful and they're just like soaring through the air. When Simone Biles does any pass that I've seen, it looks easy. And the thing about it is, it's not just not easy, it is so hard, and she's like the only person on earth who can do that pass. So consider that and consider how easy she makes it look. But she's training and has been training forever. And it's just like this idea that you are essentially training to be this it girl. You're training to be good at making things look easy. That is what Glossier is selling you. For me, Glossier didn't really come to mind until around 2015, 2016. I would have never bought a product from there at that point in time, but I did watch girls who did. It's so funny because if you watch these videos and you click on these links now, you cannot get these discounts anymore. Makes sense because obviously they don't want to pay these people for like their affiliate link if they don't have to, and they don't want to give you a discount if they don't really need to. But when you build your business model on like these cool girls giving you this influence and like telling you about these tips and like sending out products to these very niche cool girls, it's really interesting to see like later down the line you've decided that is no longer the model you want to go with without publicly announcing it. And I genuinely wonder if some of these girls who essentially have a YouTube channel completely dedicated to Glossier are aware that their links just simply no longer work. I like want to DM them and be like, girl, you have to replace it with an LTK link. Like it's just simply not working anymore. Something that I also find really interesting is they still do affiliate links and affiliate marketing, but you would have to do it through a third party. At least that's what it seems to be for me. So when I just searched on LTK, for example, it would be like a 7% rate. That's not a bad rate. It's just not that high compared to other programs. I think at the time it was was probably like 10 to 15%. And then on top of that, you're also giving your followers a discount, which sounds like a weird thing. Like, why would, I don't know, like an influencer care so much about that? But actually a lot of times they do. I'm someone who does care about that. There's kind of two reasons for this. Just simply like as a sales tactic, you're more likely to get people to utilize your affiliate link if they also get an incentive of a discount percentage off. But on top of that, like I do think that them choosing to use your link is just a nice thing. They don't have to do it. There's something that I appreciate about not only a brand being willing to give you an affiliate link, because that is taking away part of their percentage, but on top of that, willing to give your followers an additional percentage off. Like I do appreciate that. I think the biggest thing that's really interesting about Glossier is a lot of people kind of talk about these really concrete things, or talk about things like they're concrete when it comes to Glossier, but a lot of it wasn't really any of that. It was so much just a vibe. So back to these girls who I would watch, and they had their Glossier little discounts, and I thought it was so cool. The very interesting thing about this is Glossier was one of the first companies that I've ever seen do micro influencer marketing. This was like honestly before this was even a term. For those of you who aren't in the influencer space, who have not either like worked in influencer marketing or done it, you probably aren't super familiar with the idea of like how influencers are divided by brands, but essentially there's this idea of micro influencers. This number changes all the time, and it also does change by platform, but essentially a micro influencer is simply just someone who has less followers than a different influencer. So Emma Chamberlain, for example, would not be a micro influencer because she is massive and huge and has this large following, and she also works with brands that aren't small. So think about like Louis Vuitton, they have a huge budget for things like that. She would not work with a small brand. Now granted, I think she definitely could work with Glossier now, but their budget is a lot higher, so that campaign would cost at least $100,000. With these micro influencers, you usually don't even have to pay them. You can send them free product, give them that link where they can potentially get commission, and their followers can get a discount. It's honestly not a really bad route to go, and a lot of companies still do this, but it is interesting to think about. That was kind of a large part of their success, was building off of these smaller communities. It's also funny because now I think back to it and I'm like, I don't actually know that they would have partnered with larger influencers where they would actually have to pay the influencer to talk about it instead of just giving them free product in return, because these larger influencers would have made the brand a little bit too known, and that's not really what Glossier was going for. So let's talk about now who Glossier is personified. I think this is a large part of Glossier's success, and something that's not talked about a lot because it's not super concrete. When we're sitting here talking about like the vibe of Glossier, it sounds objectively a little stupid. Like I could sit here and be like, this brand to me feels like the cool girl. And then if I were at like a conference table with a bunch of executives who really just care about data, they would be like, and? Like, what does that mean? And to that, I would say data can be manipulated any way you want it to be. So like vibes are also accurate measures of success, to be honest, but whatever. Sue me. To a girl for having fun in corporate America. So the thing about Glossier is it was sort of like this cool girl, but like this idea of like, instead of being like, you can't sit with us, it was like, you can sit with us. But was that true? We'll get there. I remember like Amanda Steele said in like 2015 that she bought like a little like mini denim skirt, and I was like, so cute, could not wear that to my high school. And then I divided in my mind, and I was like, it's gonna take 6 months for this to become a thing here, because like it takes like 6 months for trends to reach like the Midwest from California. And low-key I was right, and it was a brilliant thought in my mind, and I wonder if it still holds up. I know it sounds like I'm saying a bunch of nothing, but what I actually am saying is that these thoughts and this process isn't something that just one person has, it's something that everyone has. Idea of this like cool girl has always existed, and it's just morphed. Glossier kind of allowed for this embodiment of this cool girl to exist without being a real person. They did a really good job at personifying the brand and making you want to be it. Even if you think of like the early on popular ambassadors of the brand, you would think like Jenna Lyons, for example. And if you're like me, you only know Jenna Lyons from the Real Housewives franchise now, but I didn't realize she was such a powerhouse before that. But during like her massive amount of popularity, she was really just kind of a part of like the if you know you know kind of crowd. I remember seeing her cameo on Girls and thinking like, Jenna Lyons, what the doing here? Why are you here? You don't need to be here. Along with that, they also had merch, and this was huge. So they had like sweatshirts, hoodies, those kind of things that were really casual and low-key. They also had things like random little like hats or different tote bags that you could bring places. None of their merch was particularly like fully aesthetic, seen as anything more than casual. I think this is akin really to like the brand messaging that they have, where their whole thing is casualness, casualties. No, wrong word. I think that's a huge part of Glossier, and like why they were so successful for so long is because during a time where makeup was like caked on, and like that was so the aesthetic. They were like, actually no, I don't need that. I just need a little bit of mascara. I just need a little bit of blush. I just need a little bit of this. This is something I also see now. Makeup is kind of in a really weird time where I can't tell if like a lot of makeup is popular or if like that's not really the thing. I look at like celebrities like Chapel Rowan and Sabrina Carpenter, and their faces are beat. And then there's still a lot of influencers who are really popular for doing like full faces of makeup. But makeup now sort of seems to be entering again this like lower key type of thing. It's just a really interesting thing, like the way makeup has evolved and the way our economy is so odd right now, to where it's not necessarily completely in disarray, but it's not in disarray, where people are kind of finding this like odd space between like what makeup they're wearing and like what makeup they aren't wearing, and not really knowing what's super appropriate. And if you're wondering why I'm bringing up the economy in terms of makeup, there's this idea of like lipstick and the economy being tied together. So when the economy is poor, people will still splurge on something like lipstick because it's something that is like this little thing that gives them joy and happiness, but they can still afford it. But think of brands like Dior. When you buy a blush from Dior, like you're still technically owning something from Dior without owning like $1,000 bag. It's just this idea that like you're able to splurge on certain products but not on actual things. Like the rent is due and you don't have enough money for rent, but you do have enough money for mascara. I think it also goes back to this thing where like trying is embarrassing, and I think that will never not be true, and it sucks so much because like in America especially, it's like the whole thing. You're supposed to try really hard and like do a good job at things and blah blah blah, but like you can't be seen trying, God forbid. Like if you are seen trying, that is really embarrassing. Don't do that. But again, you better try, because if you're not trying, what are you doing? So along with this kind of casualness that Glossier had, they also had models who like were kind of very strategically picked. So they were beautiful, right? Like objectively gorgeous girls, and they had features that were seen as being very pretty, especially at the time. So things like fuller brows, I think that sounds like, oh my god, how different, but like generally speaking at that time, like that was a popular thing. So this idea that like that was like such an avant-garde thing wasn't really that true. Maybe for older generations, but definitely not for like millennials and Gen Z. Here's the thing though, they did sometimes have a bit of an off feature. So that is what I call the Glossier rule. You are allowed to have one thing that is ugly about you, but everything else has to be super perfect and hot. So this is where like their diversity kind of came in. So like you could have like a gap in between your teeth, but you had to have it in like a model kind of way, and it had to be like perfectly centered. Like your teeth couldn't be like askew and like weird. Like it had to be a nice gap. It had to be a pretty gap. And then also you ideally would have like this kind of like model off-duty look where your hair is like really like works really well, and like you have this look to you that's just generally hot. Like Cara Delevingne obviously is just like a really good example of that, but there's plenty of other models that you could see on their page that were like this too. So even when it comes to like models of color, they got in a lot of trouble for really not having the best kind of diversity, equity, inclusion model going on. But in terms of, if you scroll down pretty far on their page, they did do a decent-ish job at having some form of inclusion. Now I want to preface this by saying no, they didn't also, because again it goes into the, you can have one thing that is different about you but like nothing else. So these models could be black, but they also had to be thin, and they also had to be gorgeous in every other way, right? You had to like also fit into like all of these Eurocentric beauty standards. Or sometimes they would allow like a black model who was heavier, but again like super beautiful and hot. Like they would allow that. Like two things were sort of allowed at the same time, but like it couldn't be something that was actually seen as unattractive. Like this is not to imply that like there is a certain like body weight that is ideal or a certain skin color that's ideal. There is not. Like you are a human being. It's actually more to imply the complete opposite of that. They were so stuck on this type of girl that they created that they had such a hard time straying from it. It's a really weird thing, and it's also one of those things to where like I'm not really sure I'm the expert on this, but not talking about it is completely ignoring a huge part of why Glossier flopped, and also a complete large part of like the way America operates in general. So we've talked about the rise, right? Why they did so well so quickly, but let's talk about kind of that middle section where they were doing well and why they did well for so long. I think the time that Glossier became something that people who I knew would actually own or utilize was around 2017, 2018. I think something that's not talked about a lot with Glossier and sort of like this exclusivity model that they had, I think a lot of people focus so much on the girls who wore it or the fact that the makeup itself was so sheer that like you kind of already had to look beautiful and perfect to even be able to wear it. But something that is not talked about a lot is the price point. I think when you're in your mid to late 20s, you would think that Glossier's price point is inexpensive, especially if your foundation is coming from extremely high-end brands. So if you're used to buying a foundation that's $30, $40, $50 and a mascara that is also like $20, $30, it wouldn't be that insane to you to think like, oh my god, Glossier is pretty inexpensive, but actually it's really expensive. I remember being like 15 or 16 when I first tried Glossier, and the convincing that it took in order to get this. I think I wasn't able to get Glossier until my birthday one year. I think that's when I first tried it out, because at this time, since it was D2C, it wasn't something I can go into the store and just try out. This D2C model allowed for pricing to be a little bit cheaper than it ordinarily would, because you're not paying a portion of your revenue to the stores that are carrying it. But D2C for makeup is kind of an odd thing, and why a lot of investors were really hesitant at first. That initial investment and like why she got, I think, like 11 no's before she finally got a yes. The idea of not being able to try out makeup before you buy it and also have to pay for shipping kind of seems crazy, and honestly it is. And to this day, if I were to buy Glossier, I would simply hop in my car and drive to Sephora, which we'll get to in a second, but I wouldn't order it online. The only thing I could see myself ordering online would be products that I had already tried, and if I had a specific coupon that would work online as opposed to somewhere in Sephora. But overall, the idea of only being able to buy products online is a little bit of a hardship for some people. I think this is something that is so missed in the book, and I don't understand how, because to me it feels so obvious. You have to be of a certain class level in order to casually buy makeup, especially if you're a teenager. Like, you're probably either not making money or making very little money. You usually have to do some type of convincing to get your parents to buy you something, and simply my parents were not going to buy me makeup that I had heard of from a random girl on Instagram, because I thought it would be cool and fun, especially when that makeup is like $20 for a boy brow, and they were like, what's a boy brow? Like, what does that mean? It'd be like, go to Walgreens and find something that is $10, not $12, and then also shipping. I think this is also kind of like this idea when people are talking about like, why do people eat at chain restaurants? They tend to eat at chain restaurants because they know what they're gonna get there, and they order the same thing each time because they know they like that thing. It's not innately that chain restaurants are significantly more inexpensive than somewhere that's locally owned. It's more the idea that they know the experience that they're gonna get, and they're not willing to risk their money on something unfamiliar. I think that's the biggest part that Glossier had in terms of exclusivity and a part of its branding, and it's so weird because it simultaneously worked for them and worked against them. It really helped in terms of like the actual branding of Glossier, because if you thought about like who is Glossier and like who would use it, it would be someone who's a little bit more upper middle class and was cool, aka Rachel Weisz. It kind of all goes back to that same idea, and then at the point where it became a little bit more accessible, it became a little less cool. The idea of buying something online that you've never tried and the product price points being between something that would be drugstore and something that would be actually high-end is not really a selling point in terms of the regular consumer. However, if you are someone who has a little bit more money, who's willing to spend a little bit more just to kind of fall into like that exclusivity or try something new, it's ideal for you. Which is, again, exactly who Glossier wanted as their consumer. When that number kind of grows and becomes bigger and people think about it a little longer and they're like, you know what, I really wanted to try this for such a long time, I'm gonna go ahead and bite the bullet. That's when the brand kind of saw a lot of its success, right? Because a lot of people were trying it all at once, but it still had this like branding that it was really exclusive. If you had something that was Glossier, people would still look at it and be like, oh my god, that's cool, like how do you like it? Or like, hey, do you mind if I try it? Because again, they didn't want to buy something that they didn't know how it worked, or they wanted a review from someone they trusted rather than just someone online. Especially if those people online did have affiliate links. Like, you know, at that time, I'm not sure it was as much of a conversation that we weren't really willing to buy from someone who's like an influencer, but still, it's far more trustworthy to actually know someone who is utilizing a product and their review instead of just kind of going off the cuff. I think this is a large part of that middle success story where people were using the product but the idea behind it was still really cool. I think this would be akin to someone like Rhode now. Rhode Beauty is still very popular and it's still in that heyday of like, it's a cool brand and like Hailey Bieber is still seen as really cool, and so naturally the products are also seen as really cool. But I think at some point naturally they come out with enough products and people like enough of those products that it's not just like this cool girl that you know who has the product, it's also like your mom and your neighbor and just like random people. Instead of it being this cool thing, it's seen as like this everyone has it. But during that time, no one really realized that everyone had it. Everyone still thought like this was such a unique thing to have, and like going to the stores was still such an experience. I even think about where they originally did their pop-ups being Los Angeles and New York, and you have to consider like obviously that makes sense because the markets were far more saturated in those particular areas, but those were also cool places to be. They didn't open up their pop-up in like Midtown or Times Square. They opened it up in Soho. I even remember when they did the one in Chicago that opened up, I remember like everyone I knew going there, and like I was like, oh my god, like that's so cool. But the area in Chicago that they did it was a little bit of a cooler place. So instead of doing it somewhere that was like seen as like a shopping district like the Mag Mile, I'm pretty sure they did it in Wicker Park or Lincoln Park, one of the two. I don't fully remember, but I do remember it being somewhere that was like a little less heavy foot traffic. I went to the one in Seattle, and like it was in Capitol Hill, which that is seen as a cooler neighborhood in Seattle. So it makes sense to me that like they would obviously put it there. Overall, during this time, they really did know what they were doing, and they were very aware of how their brand came off. So I think about even like what they had people in stores wearing, these kind of like utility jumpsuits. I remember trying to find like the sticky brand one at Urban Outfitters at the time because those were seen as so cool. It gave off that same not trying too hard aesthetic, but it was also just objectively cute. There was even a point in which like they would encourage their corporate employees to dress a little bit better because they wanted to be seen more as a tech company, and they felt like that gave them a certain prestige whenever people would come in and like give speeches and like whatever, like they felt like that gave them like a certain look to them, which is objectively really funny because to me that reads so not tech company. That reads like investment banking to me, which is not at all what I feel like Glossier is. At this time they really couldn't do anything wrong. And then 2020 happened. As Madonna would say, this was the great equalizer. Obviously we know that significant things happened in 2020, like perhaps the global pandemic, but it also brought up a lot of really necessary conversations that hadn't really been had yet, especially on the corporate level. I think this was a good thing in a lot of ways, but I also think it led to like a lot of really performative actions from brands, because at the end of the day, like, can a brand be moral? Not really. Like, it's a brand, it's a company. They're not giving you products, they're selling you products. Glossier wasn't handing out lip balms, they were selling an aesthetic of a girl you should be and selling you that to the point to where you would buy their products. But it also feeds into like this weird parasocial relationship that people seem to have with the brand. And again, that was part of its success, but again, it would be part of its failure. It's not to say that Glossier was the only brand that was being called out at this time. It was absolutely not. So many other brands were also being called out for their actions because Glossier was seen as like this idyllic of cool girl who was not just cool but nice. She had like all these good views on everything. And then you would see like Black employees weren't treated very well, and like a part of the corporate staff there was not a lot of representation. A lot of people had like really fair complaints about working practices that went on there. And then you're like, oh wait, maybe like this cool girl is not that cool and maybe she's also problematic. And then it goes back to the whole like you can sit with us idea. It kind of adds even like a bigger asterisk to it instead of it being like, if you use our products which make you hot, pretty, and cool. It's like, but also if you fit into this like specific mold that we seem to have accidentally created, sorry. And that's even how the apology came off. There was an Instagram called Out of the Gloss, which was kind of like an expose of all of these issues that these employees, specifically the retail employees, were experiencing. Don't actually recall this like when it happened, but all of this is still on their Instagram, so it's definitely worth going into and looking at. I think people who are just kind of casually consuming Glossier, like this didn't do a ton to them, because for me personally, like as someone who's casually consuming it, I didn't even know this happened until reading the book and doing my research on this. But it is super interesting to think about and like recognize that this was an actual thing that was going on. I think a large part of why I'm mentioning that so many people didn't actually know that this was happening is because I think a lot of times when a brand gets called out for things and then they kind of flop after, there's this idea that they've been canceled, or that it's essentially like their paying for their action. And let me just say to that, I completely disagree, and I don't think that's at all what happened here. I don't think Glossier was canceled because I don't think literally anyone has ever been canceled ever. Like, do they still bring in money? Are they still launching new products? Are they still posting as normal? Yeah, so like, did they get canceled? I wouldn't say so. Kind of simply based on that, like, this couldn't be the reason for their downfall. Another thing that was cited is that they switched their model from being D2C to being in Sephora, and that was somehow like this negative thing that happened to the brand. I can tell you, like, no one who's actually just like a regular consumer of products really cares about the channel in which they receive it, other than it did make the brand become more accessible. That was kind of the core issue of what happened to Glossier and like why it was kind of flopping. Glossier's switch to also being in Sephora made the brand also still a little bit more elevated, right? So it benefited them by being more accessible to more people. People who had never really had an interest in trying the brand were suddenly like, you know what, I'm gonna do it. Another thing is they had a super popular perfume called You, and people were like dying over this thing. Everyone wanted it. People in the street were like, oh my god, like, what are you wearing? People would literally make TikToks about this. The idea behind You is that like it's gonna smell different on everyone because it smells like you. I think is why a lot of people liked it, because if you're not super into perfumes and you don't want to smell too much of something, you are going to utilize something that's a little bit more low-key. Also, objectively, the packaging was just super cute. I think that's what Glossier did right so many times. The packaging was just absolutely adorable. Here's where I actually think they flopped. So I think part of it definitely did have to do with people kind of had a bad taste in their mouth for brands who weren't particularly good during 2020. Another thing that I feel like fed into this flop era was that Glossier as an aesthetic kind of got replaced by other terms. So instead of being like, she's such a Glossier girl, it kind of got replaced almost exactly with the term clean girl. It was implying nearly the exact same thing. Another thing that Glossier did so deeply wrong, and I can't believe they did this till this day, is they got rid of their bubble mailers. These were so iconic, and like my brain can't even fathom what the decision behind this was. So back in like, I believe October, November of 2023, they announced that they had a new CEO coming in. This CEO was far less like in the media herself and just like actually far more classically trained essentially. So for example, she got her MBA from Harvard. She had a lot of experience with other D2C brands, but on top of that, as a CEO essentially entering a company, like they get to have this position of CEO, but then they also have to do a lot of things that the first CEO didn't want to do. So naturally that meant laying off employees, which sucks, but I don't think that's enough to like diminish a brand, right? Like, it's something that doesn't reflect very well of a brand, but it's not something that I think people would be willing to cancel a brand for. I could be totally wrong in that, like people absolutely might be willing to do that, but I don't think that we view layoffs as like nefarious in the long term to the point of like not buying a product, especially if it's a product you like. Not to say that they didn't get any negative press from this, it's just I don't think that was the reason why Glossier flopped. I think a lot of things kind of fall into that category though, of like when you're doing layoffs, that means that you're also cutting a lot of costs elsewhere, which would be the bubble mailers. It's such good advertising and it's free and it's this cool thing that you get with your purchases. To me, it's one of those things that it is not something you're allowed to cut. They also got rid of stickers. So I was never super into the stickers, but I know a lot of people who were, and they would collect them, and they still even sell on eBay for about $10, which doesn't sound that crazy, but like it kind of is, considering like the fact that it's a sticker and it's from a brand that you typically would get for free in a mailer. So we have a few things kind of working against Glossier at this point, right? They got rid of the bubble mailers, which sounds silly, but it really is a huge thing. They were now less seen as like an exclusive brand because there's something that you can buy at Sephora, which means like nearly anyone can access it. And in general, because they had gained so much popularity, like there is just significant lack of exclusivity because now everyone and their mother has it. It's not seen as like this it cool girl brand anymore. And also on top of that, once you get like allegations of racism and people are kind of being a little bit more conscious with their dollars and where they're spending it, they don't want to necessarily give it to a brand that is problematic in a lot of ways. But I don't think all of these things could be like the biggest reason for a flop. Something that I do think really hurt the brand is reformulation. So they went and they made this pledge where they decided that they were going to make all of their products vegan. This kind of fit into Sephora's, like, I think they have like a clean kind of initiative going on where a certain percentage of their brands fall under this clean initiative. It's just sort of like a performative, essentially, like eco marketing type of thing where it's just like greenwashing and like whatever. I have my own opinions on brands and companies doing stuff like that in general, but that's neither here nor there. Essentially, they reformulated a lot of their products and made them vegan, and people had a lot to say. There were even reports that the You perfume was different. I can't confirm or deny this, but they did essentially say on their Instagram that it was not different, despite people being like, no, it's for sure different. I really don't know. I think because it's like a pheromone perfume, it can be a little bit challenging to fully tell with something like that. But still, the fact that people feel like it's different isn't a great thing. You want products to have consistency, and if they're not having that consistency, then what is going to happen to your core audience, right? The people who are continuously rebuying your products, like, they don't care anymore. They're not going to want to do it. That brings us to the anti-flop, or the resurrection. This is where Glossier is essentially now, and it's more up to them and consumers what happens next. So they recently made this decision where they are no longer making their products vegan. To me, it's kind of funny, even the way it's been branded was like no longer vegan formula or something like that. Kind of instead of just saying like back to the original formula, they have like flat out said that the products are not vegan, and they're like proud of it. As someone who's not vegan, it doesn't really affect me very much, but I can really understand why this would offend people, and they sort of don't seem to care. It's just kind of a funny thing to me because I feel like a lot of brands would never say it like that. A lot of times when a product's not vegan, instead of saying it's not vegan, they kind of skirt over the fact that it's not vegan. They'll say something else. They'll just kind of like completely go around it. Instead, they'll be like, it's not tested on animals, which is still true, by the way. That was a part of their original mission statement in like 2015. It's like never tested on animals, and they still aren't tested on animals. But obviously, if they're not vegan, like, it's kind of a funny thing to be so proud of it not being tested on animals, because it's like, but like made with them, but certainly not tested on them. However, there have been a lot of really positive reports about people enjoying the original formula that is back again. So they have had a really good response to it. Also, recently Target announced their collab with Kylie Cosmetics where it's going to be in Target stores, and it's so funny because they posted a video of the shopping cart thing being turned pink on Target, and then everyone in the comments were like, oh my god, it's Glossier, and then it just wasn't. I think that shows that it really does have a lot of holding power, and as long as they continue to make good products that people actually enjoy, they should be fine. Something I did find, and I think this is a really good place to kind of like test a little bit of like where they are, is their Reddit page. A lot of people are selling their Glossier products on there. I don't know if that's a super common occurrence, but a lot of people kind of like are not really posting like a full face of Glossier anymore. They're more just kind of posting nostalgic things or things that they see as like a benefit to the brand. They're also posting things like, oh my god, it's not vegan anymore, this is so exciting. But they're not really posting a lot of like full face of Glossier or any other product reviews. However, something that is worth noting is their most popular posts on that subreddit. They peaked a lot about 4 years ago, and that's where the majority of these popular posts are. But a lot of them are from like around 20 to 30 days ago. This to me shows that there is some type of resurrection happening within the brand. People are willing to notice and talk about it a little bit more, which is interesting, and it gives kind of a good shining light on the future potentially that Glossier could have. They're also posting job openings. Part, again, to me, like, I don't think it matters as much to consumers, but it is interesting to me that they are willing to put more money into products and product development and marketing those products than they have been in the past. Even recently, I've seen a lot of Glossier ads, which also could signal that this is like really them trying to pull at anything that they have. Sometimes when an ad campaign is a little bit too aggressive, to me it reads as like desperate. But to me, this kind of makes sense since they're doing a relaunch of original products. They do want to market it, so it makes sense that they would have a higher ad spend. But in general, it is definitely very, very interesting how they've positioned themselves again. Which kind of brings us to the question, did Glossier actually ever really flop, or did it kind of just fall from its peak? Glossier was doing really, really well, and it kind of hit that perfect sweet spot between being like this cool girl brand that not everyone knew about to kind of also being the brand that everyone knew about but still thought was cool. During that time, they had a lot of sales. People were really enjoying their products. There weren't a lot of competitors on the market at that point. Now there are so many and they're not seen as that cool anymore. But does that actually mean that they flopped? I don't know. I think if you build a brand on being like the cool girl brand, it definitely makes sense that people would think that you're maybe going downhill a little bit if you're no longer that. But it's still a highly established brand with some genuinely good products. So a full-on flop, I kind of don't think so. I think it honestly just had a really good couple of years really early on as a company. And I think that can be hard to recover from in terms of trying to get those numbers again, because it's just not really possible. At some point, things have to kind of steady out. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Glossier. I don't think it's ever going to be like a Maybelline type of brand, but I also don't think it was ever meant to be. You have to consider the products and what they're trying to do with them is a little bit niche. They're trying to make makeup that doesn't really look like makeup, so that's not for everyone. They also have curated such an aesthetic that it's kind of hard to stray outside of that. So when it comes to full-on reach, like you're not gonna get everyone there. With a brand like Maybelline, everyone and their mother can use it and it wouldn't be weird either way. A 13-year-old could be putting on like a mascara from Maybelline and you wouldn't bat an eye, and same with the 60-year-old. Like it really is the same thing. They're also not priced like everyone else, right? So they're in this weird little sweet spot where you're paying essentially for the packaging, not necessarily because the products are so much better, but the people who value that are going to still continue to shop there. In addition to this, with them being in Sephora, I'm not sure exactly how long I foresee this partnership lasting. Are they going to be like an Urban Decay where they have sort of always been in Sephora and probably will always be in Sephora? Or are they going to be like other brands that have fallen to the wayside and go right back to that D2C model? I don't know. Something that's also really important is their Instagram is still gaining followers pretty consistently. So a lot of times when a brand is truly flopping, they'll have a large amount of followers, but they'll be losing them at an alarming rate. Glossier is not doing that at all. Like their Instagram feed is still amazing. They're still gaining followers really regularly. Like nothing is that alarming about what we're seeing. So overall, do I think Glossier is in its resurrection? No. But do I think it even flopped? Also no. I think it's just at a point that is no longer its peak. Brand had a really interesting come up, and I think it's worth noting in a lot of case studies because I don't think I've ever seen a brand fully make such an identity for itself in such a way that people connect a whole color to it. It's also still priced a little bit higher, so in terms of it being this kind of cool girl brand that not everyone can obtain, that's still a little bit true. It's not going to be a brand that like you see a bunch of little kids using. First of all, because it's not as makeup-y, so it's not as fun for them, but also because it's not that cheap and it's not that inexpensive. I think it really depends on how next generations view Glossier and how they view makeup in general. Do they want a more baked on face? Do they want higher amounts of makeup? If so, Glossier is gonna have to learn to adapt. Or not. Depends on what their next model is. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I hope you guys enjoyed this analysis of where Glossier is at now. Kind of its rise, fall, and resurrection. Let me know if you guys want to see any more videos like this because I will be doing them. Do not forget to subscribe down below. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Both are at samantha.hope. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!